G'day everyone and welcome to another episode of Lead on Purpose. My name is James Middleton and for the last 20 years I've led teams of all shapes and sizes, from the Australian Defence Force through to the private sector. These days they help organisations build ethical, purposeful leadership at every level. I also help you become the leader that you want to be. I explore real-world leadership challenges, bring you inspiring stories from experienced leaders and give you practical strategies to help you lead with confidence, clarity and purpose. Today, I'm joined by Michelle Creevey. Michelle is a supply chain and procurement leader who's worked across a diverse range of sectors, including tourism, hospitality, and defence industry. You'll hear Michelle talk about her unique experiences transforming the supply chain within Australia's defence industry. Supply chain in this context is far more than just buying things for a business to use. Supply chain is integrated with every part of a product's journey, from raw materials through to delivery, sustainment, and eventually decommissioning and disposal with an end user. In this case, the end user is the Australian Defence Force. Together, we discuss the importance of communication in leadership, as well as resilience and vulnerability. Michelle shares some really personal stories about times when she got it right, times when she got it wrong, and the often unseen reality of truly high-performing teams. So, let's get into it. G'day, Michelle, and welcome to Lead on Purpose. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks, James. Really happy to be here.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your career been like? What's your journey in leadership been like?
Yeah, so my career has been quite eclectic. If I look at it on paper, it feels hard to describe to people all the step changes that I've had. But it was all very organic. So I started out as a young girl going into interior design. I was part of an award-winning team. I then moved states, and at the time I would have had to have gone back through extra studies to comply with state building laws. And I just felt I wanted to have a break. End up working in hospitality just to simply live the Melbourne life for a few months, and ended up falling into a group of friends who had got a space lease in a laneway in Melbourne, and found out that I had done interior design, asked me to come in and take a look. I ended up spending my days off helping them pull apart and design this bar space. And one of the owners pulled out before they opened, and they offered me to come in as an owner. Here I was 25 years of age, and that bar and restaurant became an iconic bar and restaurant in Melbourne, and set the scene for the laneway bar scene in Melbourne. That gave me 7 years of lots of fun and hard work, being my own business owner, and it was a very successful business. So at the end of that, I had a young daughter, wanted to move back to Brisbane to be with my family, and I switched careers, and I worked a number of years in tourism and hospitality at a national level. And as my career evolved, I found my way into procurement and supply chain, which at the time wasn't really a discipline that you could learn and go into the trade. This is going back 20 years now. And it often came from being salespeople who went to the other side of the table, or finance people. And the beauty of that was, having been in a national bids and marketing role for a number of years, I really understood what truly was being asked of suppliers, and I didn't drink the Kool-Aid of a good salesperson. I was very good at jigging into things. And so it was a natural transition for me, and I really enjoyed it. I worked for the Star Casino Group for a number of years. I was a major project lead for the Future Star program, which was the Sydney Casino design, construction and rebuild. That was obviously on a brownfield site, so they were operating a multi-billion-dollar business while they were going through major design and construction. So that was an enormous learning experience for me in terms of getting things done on time and on schedule while you're still trading. They had 10,000 visitors a day, billions of dollars in cash, and they had to preserve all of that while they built a whole new casino. And then my last role, 12 years at Boeing Defence Australia. So 2 substantive roles. The first one for almost equal parts in that 12 years, running and managing the procurement team. And Boeing Defence Australia has the delegation of authority for all Boeing Australia subsidiaries for indirect procurement. So it was a very big role supporting all subsidiaries here in Australia. And then senior supplier development and diversity in what was then the newly formed Australian Industry Capability Team. So that's, as I said, it feels eclectic, but my role has always been customer focused, design focused, thought leadership, all of those things, all of the things that I love to do in my personal life with design and everything else I've always found a natural intersection with my professional life, if that makes sense. I'm a big picture person and I can visualize things and I've got a spatial awareness of stuff. So that always held me in good stead in my professional world.
Now, I can see what you mean about it being eclectic, and I'm interested to sort of pull apart a few of those things as we go along. You talked about change within the star environment, and then at Boeing, the where AIC, or Australian Industry Capability, was only starting to become something that people talked about and something that people really put value in. So that can you help me understand how that initial lesson of listening as a leader translated into your own leadership style, if it did, or how it influenced you as a leader of people as you progress through to take on bigger and bigger roles?
What I would say that comes to mind first and foremost is, there's certain expressions that have become very common in the last few years that annoy the hell out of me. Things like taking people on the journey and all that. But it's very true. Change management means you've got to take people on a journey and they've got to understand that what's in it for me. Otherwise, they will fail to connect. If it feels like it's just adding more work to their day job, you're adding a new process to something and they think it's just adding more work without understanding the root cause and what you're managing or why and where that feeds into the bigger picture and ultimately how it does support them to do their job well, then you won't get buy-in. So, change management and that leadership is about open and transparent communication. In my opinion, to the extent of saying when it is the case, I don't have the answer. I might be leading this solution, but I don't have the answer. I can't come up with the right solution without the input of this team. We need to do this as a collective. There's times where you know the solution and you have to just say, you have to trust yourself and say, look, as your manager, as your leader, this is the solution that we need to put in place and this is how we're going to work it and this is the roles everyone's going to play. But when you don't know what the solution is and you absolutely need a collective thought and you need to draw out the subject matter expertise and the on-the-job experience that the team have every day, then equally owning that and having what I refer to as radical candor, being very, very transparent. And I've found that served me well.
I love that term, radical candor, because it is something that requires a lot of vulnerability as a leader. Because to admit you as a leader don't have the answer, don't have the solution when there's 10, 20, 30 people in front of you looking to you for the answer because they're feeling uncertainty and that's playing on their fear and challenging them to do their work can be really, really difficult because we want to be that person that people come to with their problems. We want to be that person that helps and solves. But sometimes in doing that, we're creating this illusion that everything has to come to us as a leader and everything has to have our approval, which is just not the case.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, you've got to go in with the project plan. You've got to go into those conversations to say, this is how we're going to stand it up. This is a sponsorship we need to get. So this is what we need to prove and provide evidence of to leadership above us to get this done. We are then going to go through an implementation phase and we're going to structure who does what and why. Then we're going to execute. And what we're going to do before we start that execution is in that implementation phase, we're going to look at what the measures of success are. And we're going to agree as a collective as to the data that we need to monitor and measure to know we've arrived at good and we've succeeded in what we need to do. And then we will close out this project. We will do a lessons learned. We will have to retire a process or we will have to retire something. And so those conversations lead with, you absolutely demonstrating to your team that you've got this and there is a plan. There's going to be a structure behind it that will give the team comfort that we know what we're doing, we're leaning into it with the right balance. But yeah, if you don't know what the solution is and you have to say, we need to have a workshop to really get to the bottom of what this issue is so we can design the solution. um, More power. There's more power that comes from that than always just telling people how to do something. And I think it's Richard Branson that said, you know, you employ smart people, so kind of let them get on with their job. You've employed them for a reason. That's obviously not verbatim, but it's very true. If you've got really smart minds, and often do, we all often do in our teams have some really smart minds. If you discredit that by not listening to them and bringing them into the solutioning every now and then, they're going to become disengaged, and you will lose good people, or you certainly won't be leveraging the strengths of your team.
Absolutely. And I think what you just touched on there through that explanation of, well, the role of a leader in that process of change is to not have all the answers, but to have clarity for themselves as a leader and provide clarity to their team and their people in their organization about where we need to go, the challenges that might face us along the way, and what good looks like in the end. Creating that clarity isn't having all the answers. It's you creating that clarity is at least bringing everyone together with the understanding that we know some stuff, we don't know other stuff. And if we come across things we don't understand, then this is what we're going to do about it. And you're creating that certainty, at least for people around, okay, I know I'm going to go from A to B to C, but there may be changes along the way. And that's okay, because I know the direction we're going in. I know personally when I've encountered these challenging situations around change in workplaces as a leader and as and definitely early on in my career as well, the lack of that clarity about the why we're changing, the direction we're going in, what the desired end state is, that's actually what creates the uncertainty and creates the disconnection and has people retreat out of fear because they don't know what their own job is going to look like. And when we do that, the real impact of the organization there is that change just stops and it falters and it might fade away, but the damage from that poor process and that poor communication is already done. In what you talked about there, I can see there's a difference between the process-driven change management, which is part of it. We have to do the technical stuff, but also the people-focused element of change leadership. What do you see, or what have you seen as your role, whether it be at Star or at Boeing through the procurement leadership lens? What do you see as your role as a leader through change, and what can you do for people?
I think the best example that comes to mind is when Boeing went through a transformation and they went to a capability model. I was a change agent on that project, so I wasn't in the core team designing the change, but I was in the extended team that tested and provided feedback on potential change, but also disseminated what was happening in that project to the supply chain function. So my role at the time was to provide feedback into that core team. This will work, that won't work. But in managing that project and being a change agent, sitting between the transformation team and the function and the people that were going to be impacted, it meant that I very quickly embraced that, again, that transparency was essential. This is actually what they're talking about. This is what they're actually working through, and providing an avenue for any supply chain person, either identifying themselves or anonymously providing feedback on some of the things that they were talking about. So if they were looking at a potential change to supply chain, saying, this is what the team's focused on at the moment, this is what they're looking at, this is how you can provide feedback. You can either contact me direct, you can put it into the portal, you can do whatever. And the feedback I got at the time from my peers in supply chain was, after a few emails and a cycle of seeing what I was doing, they got a lot of comfort with the transformation project, and they a lot of them just sat back and said, we can't affect the change. It's going to be what it's going to be, but we trust our peers and colleagues that they're looking at this with the interest of the customer and the company and the people at heart. And so we'll just sit back and wait for the outcome. So there wasn't all this side water cooler banter about what they thought was going to happen and how many jobs were going to go, and it all pretty much went away, and they all just sat back and trusted the process. So, um, but it also meant that I had to be an advocate for supply chain. So when that transformation team were going through certain elements and working through the art of the possible, I was very clear on the feedback I was receiving from the team. I was very clear on my knowledge of supply chain, how it worked and how it best operated. And so I tried to be, I tried to influence and support their planning by knowing supply chain better and knowing what was important to the people. Because none of the people on the transformation project were supply chain people. They were change management, quality, etc., and chiefs of staff. So I made sure that they knew supply chain. And so again, it's about knowing your customer, right? So when they made decisions, they made better and more informed decisions on behalf of the supply chain function at the time.
That's a really interesting line there, that the people associated with the change were technical change experts. Because in an organization that size, that has it carries incredible risk through change, because they're dealing with aviation, they're dealing with incredibly complex systems. And in defense industry, they're dealing with national security. So getting it wrong has implications that, or could have consequences that far exceed that of just the business.
Absolutely.
And so I find it really interesting that your role was to still communicate, and to still, but not communicate necessarily down to your team. I'm sure you did that, of course, but communicate back up, because for change to be effective, people need to be able to make good decisions, informed decisions, and data-driven decisions. And if they don't have an inherent understanding of what they're doing or what the change means for a particular capability or function, then as a leader, I can see that you've taken that on yourself and gone, well, I can help this change by communicating the needs, communicating the specifics around supply chain. What effect do you think that communication in those two directions, or all directions really, how did that influence the trust that your people had in you and your broader stakeholders had in both you and your team?
Yeah, look, I'd like to say, and I've certainly experienced it right throughout my time at Boeing, I built a really good team, and they knew I always had their back. I got to know my team, so I knew who they were and how they operated, and I leveraged that every time I needed that strength. And I helped them manage the gaps. I don't like to call it strengths and weaknesses. I think no one's got a weakness. We've just got gaps in professional knowledge or learnings or how we operate. We can be doing things better. It doesn't mean we're weak, right? So my team often gave me feedback that, I supported them. I had their back. I knew their stakeholders, so I knew who they were supporting internally. And I knew what they needed to get out of their day job and what they needed to feel supported. There was no difference between how you treated one team member to the next. And I had a very diverse team, but it was hard to manage because you had to really take into account communication styles and how people work and values and all that sort of stuff. But what it really did do was it absolutely brought together a team that backed each other, because they really got to appreciate what each other could bring to the team. And everyone had their place. Everyone had a niche. It wasn't a cookie cutter team of everyone looked and felt the same and had the same background and experience, because that actually doesn't bring diversity of thought or innovation to a team. So
Mm.
I built a really diverse team, and I benefited from that in the long run, and they all benefited from that. So it was, yeah, I think for me it was recognizing every team member, not just for their professional skills and what they bring to that, but also their personal attributes and their ways of working, that when you get to know that as a leader, you create a safe space for your team, and you really do bring out the best. And despite, you know, your ethnicity, your age, your religion, whatever, you can come together as a collective and serve a common purpose, is really rewarding.
I love that, Michelle. There are so many strengths to diversity of thought. That's how we solve problems in new and innovative ways. And as you said back at the start, if everyone's cookie cutter, everyone's cut from the same mold, and we all think the same, well, we're probably going to we're going to agree, we're going to get through, we're going to get
Yeah,
through decisions very
you're
quickly,
going to pat each other on
but
the
we're all
back
going to
very
have
quickly.
the same opinion.
Yeah.
Great, everyone's happy, right? And it's easy to connect there, and which and then this push pull of the strengths and I won't say weaknesses because it's not a weakness, but the challenges that diversity brings. And what you talked about there in terms of communication again and understanding is, well, when we communicate and we understand and people feel like they have space to share their own personal concerns and be vulnerable themselves, well, that builds trust. And when there's that trust and when people feel psychologically safe within that work environment to be different, to think differently, to challenge the status quo because they do see something through a different light. That's how we get innovation and that's how we move things forward. So how did you, and you mentioned there in the towards the end of what you were saying, towards the end of your story, that there was this common purpose. So how did you as a leader, knowing, and I know your passion for diversity and your passion for making a difference to every different part of society you can, how did you as a leader in that case take diversity and focus the strengths or maximize the strengths and not allow it to necessarily deteriorate like it can, where we start to focus so much on what makes us different that we lose sight of that common purpose?
Yeah, that's a really good question, James. I'd like to think that the work I did with my team was recognised by the then director of supply chain when they went through the reorganisation. And the Boeing company said, as part of the capability model, that a core and a critical role for supply chain was supplier development and diversity. And I got direct appointed into that role. And the director of supply chain, when he direct appointed me into the role, just said, Michelle, I can't think of anyone better to execute this work. And I sat there and I went, right, this is an exciting new opportunity. So what do you want me to do? It's literally what I recall saying to him. And he said, I don't know. He goes, I don't know how we're going to execute this work. He said, but if anyone's going to get on with it, you will. Because he knew I'm a very resilient person, which I think is a needed thing in leadership. And if it's not a natural attribute of yours, you should be doing what you can to understand how you can become more resilient because you're going to fail. Things are going to hurt. There's going to be work pressures. There's going to be things out of your control. And there's things that are going to shock you and impact you. You know, you lose a really great team member right at the time when you can't afford to, and there's no way you can keep them. Um, I was lucky I didn't actually do that because my procurement team became a very rock solid, stable team. And the only team members I lost in the time I was managing them were a couple where, you know, we had a candid conversation about the role wasn't really working out for them. And we gave them the opportunity to go looking for a job rather than get performance managed. And we would support them through that transition, either to find a new job internally or externally. And so it was a really healthy separation or team members that moved around internally to Boeing and got new opportunities. So I had a really solid team. I think what drove that often was my resilience. They saw me dust myself off. They saw me learn lessons. They saw me get on with things and not, you know, get burdened by every single small thing that broke. So to back them when something broke. I wouldn't turn around and say, James did a terrible job. I'd go, okay, what can we learn from this, James? And potentially what's got to change, you know, either about how you work or about our own policy, procedures or systems. What impacted that breaking, you know? So not being judgmental, but looking at the root cause of things because again, if you always and only blame the person, then that's how the team will feel. And they will never feel safe coming to you with something that's broken or a problem or an issue they've got, because they will feel, rightfully so, like you're just going to point at them and say, well, you're not doing your job and you're not doing it well, versus, right, you've got this problem. Where do you think it's breaking? What do you think we need to fix? So I'll probably digress a little bit from what you asked me, but I think diversity and inclusion takes resilience. And for me, it's about living and buying your values. So in supply chain, there was a reconciliation action plan for Boeing Defence Australia. So they had an obligation and a requirement to buy from Indigenous businesses. They're a large veteran employer. So recruiting and buying from veteran-owned businesses is important. Veterans need to see that they're supporting their community, so they need to be buying their values. So it was a very value alignment role. You know, it had to be value aligned what we were doing, and in order to achieve, as I said, you just have to be resilient. It's a really hard process, social procurement and Australian industry capability, and so you have to be really resilient. Don't know whether I've answered that question the way that you set it up.
It's great because you've actually brought up a few more really interesting points that you talk about resilience there, and I'll loop back on that one in just a moment, because I do want to focus on your own personal challenges as a leader and as the human element of leadership on the other side of the coin. You know, you've talked a lot about the human element of leadership of the, I guess, the forward facing stuff, but I do want to explore in a moment your own challenges. But what you said there about the values alignment, that's really what fundamentally brings a diverse team together, I feel, in that, well, we may have all these, you know, outside of our work environment. Well, if you think about it as a giant Venn diagram, we've got our own personal values and professional values and social values and all those things because we've been raised differently. And that's great. That's what influences our ability to think differently and approach problems differently. But what we have as we bring it into the middle is, well, we've all chosen to work here for this business. We've all chosen to work with each other. As much as a business chooses people to bring in, as much as leadership in a business chooses people to hire, those people choose the business as well. And it's that values alignment because we collectively believe in what the organization is trying to do for society. In the case of companies in defense industry, that commitment to national security, that's why people do what they do. And it's that type of thing that I can see common elements through your career, whether it's, you know, the bar and restaurant. Well, hey, I have no doubt that you as a leader there and a business owner wanted to give customers and clients the best possible experience so they could really enjoy themselves and feel better and celebrate whatever they were celebrating.
Yeah,
people connect with that. And when you exactly, and when people connect with those values and they align their values like that with their personal, professional, team, organizational values, and they live them and breathe them every day, that then allows people to approach problems focusing on a solution, not just how it affects them, but how it affects the organization as a whole. So that is really, really interesting to explore that, because I can see, even though there's huge differences between hospitality and design and then defense industry, your common tenets and your common leadership values are very evident to me as you go through there. And those are showing, and those show every day, no doubt. And that is why people stay in organizations. And if people are not staying in organizations, you're losing professional knowledge all the time. You're building discontent and you're fostering an environment where people think, no, what's going to happen next, rather than, oh, how can we work together to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, and the culture of an organization is values. What are the values that we hold true? And it has to be, leadership team have to be very clear. They have to be consistent, and they have to demonstrate them. But the real culture of an organization happens at the people level. If the everyday team member isn't demonstrating and living those values, the culture will fall apart at the seams. So no matter what leaders do, if we as humans within the business, if our values aren't aligned with the messaging of that organization, go, go. Don't become part of the problem. Don't argue unless they're really negative values and you know they need to change. But, well, even for that reason, go. So I had someone say to me last year that just remember the company you work for is not your family. The boss isn't your parent. Your co-workers aren't your siblings. And when it's time to ask for promotion, ask for it. When it's time to ask for more money and get recognised more, ask for it. And when it's time to go, go. You don't get a life contract with an organisation. They don't give you a contract to say, please tell us exactly how much money you would like to retire and what age that would be, and we're going to work that plan, right? So when your values aren't aligned and you don't feel the culture of the organisation is healthy for you, either be the positive change or go. And leadership team, the amount of people I've heard over the years, when a morale is low or the culture doesn't feel at its healthiest, who point their finger up the food chain. And I, on a couple of occasions, have said to team members, you do realise the leadership team is a core leadership team of 8 people out of this organisation of 3,000. So what responsibility do the 2,992 other humans have in terms of the morale of this organisation and its value-led interaction with each other, right?
That's it.
So
It
leadership
is.
sometimes, for the
You're
most part, is actually living the values that you hold true, but making sure your values are aligned to the organisation, and as a leader, ensuring and holding your team accountable to those values and being the leader of those values. You know, the behaviours that the organisation say are the behaviours of the organisation. Exemplify that, and it's don't make it corporate wallpaper.
exactly right. It's so often we see in organizations, oh, those are our values, and they point to something on the wall, but no one, those were written and crafted by an external consultant 10 years ago, and there's been turnover because people just leave. People leave, new people come in, and things change, and change is just part of life. But these values now don't reflect what we're doing day to day, or what we're doing day to day doesn't reflect those, because, well, we don't understand them anymore. We don't align with those anymore. We don't understand what you mean by commitment to excellence or inclusion. That's not, because the fact of the matter is that those definitions naturally change in language over time. You look at the difference in, say, inclusion between what we talk about now in society compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. Things change. So unless those are lived and they are, it's the values document, the value statement, it's a living, breathing article where it should reflect what we're doing. What we're doing should reflect those, and there should be that alignment there. And when there isn't, well, that's when we get exactly what you said, where people start to point the finger because, oh, it's someone else's problem because I'm not a leader. But I talk about on this podcast all the time that leadership isn't a title. It's not a rank. It's not a position of authority. Leadership is a choice. And everyone, no matter where they are in an organization, has a responsibility to the culture of that organization, whether it's 2 people in a team or 3,000 people in a nationwide organization. Everyone has a responsibility to that culture, and they need to make the choice to have a positive influence on that culture, not a negative influence, because it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, you will influence the people around you, who will influence the people around them, who will influence the people around them. And those negative attitudes, those negative habit patterns fester and grow until such a point where you have a watershed moment where we now have to have a cultural reset because it wasn't addressed in the first instance, because there was a lack of alignment, and it wasn't addressed because either leaders weren't holding teams to account, teams weren't holding each other to account, or peers weren't holding each other to account. And that's the challenge that we have in leadership, is that if we're the one who comes down and points the finger all the time, well, What are people going to do back to us if things go wrong?
It's absolutely keeping yourself accountable and checking yourself. And I had a couple of times where my behavior in a meeting wasn't the way it should be. And I would absolutely circle back to the team almost immediately when the meeting finished to say, hey, raised my, not yelled ever, right? But I might have had a more pointed manner. I might have been stronger in my position. I may not have listened to someone. And I would either go back to the individual and own it, or I'd go back to the team. I'd say that wasn't my best hour, right? Um, and conversely, I held the team accountable. So, you know, um, they saw me live and breathe the values and the behaviours that were the tone for the team, and I held them accountable. They knew exactly what was acceptable. It's like raising a teenager, right? You have to set the ground rules on what the behaviours are like. We can all have a bad day, that's fine, but that's not how you talk to your mum or your dad. That's not how you talk to your friends. That's not how you behave. And I think the proudest moments we have, and I know with my daughter, the proudest moments I've had is when I know I haven't been in the room, and when I know
Hmm.
she
Hmm.
is intelligent, and she is, an incredible human doing some incredible things in her career. And I don't have to be in the room with her in meetings with her colleagues to know she's, a great team member and a great a force for change, right? And so with my own team, I knew there was times where they were in supplier negotiations or supplier meetings or internal stakeholder meetings, and people would give me feedback about how great they were and what they brought to those conversations. And they were my proudest moments. It wasn't what they were just showing me and the team. It was what they were upholding and taking forward outside of that environment where there was no manager to impress, or no, like, oh, I think I've got to behave this way because I'm in front of the team and this is the way we operate. It became a lived way of operating for our team, and a common standard that's how everyone behaved, and that's what we did, and that's who we were. Um, and so, yeah, some of my proudest moments were feedback I'd get when I wasn't even in the room.
And that's when we know as leaders that our influence over the culture, and when the culture is reflecting us or our own behaviors, is when people aren't looking to us to be held to account. They're holding each other to account. They're holding themselves to account. And when we have that confidence to leave the room, because we know that the values that we talk about as a team are still going to be adhered to, they're still going to be represented without that requirement to, herd the cats, as it were. That's when we know as leaders that we are having the right influence. We are having the ethical and productive influence over the culture.
And that was the key thing too, was I felt a sense of comfort that people enjoyed their job. They were coming to work giving their best selves, and they were leaving with a sense of feeling satisfied, I should say, about their day, right? Because they exemplified all of these great characters and traits and behaviors. And so you go, they've got to be enjoying their job. They've got to feel safe
Hmm.
and trusted in those environments. They've got to feel like they are the subject matter expert, which I always encourage them to acknowledge. Don't get walked over in a meeting. If it's something to do with supply chain and procurement, you lead that part of the conversation, and you make sure that everyone's aware of the policy and procedure and the process, and they're supported, and that you've got this, right? Um, so when I got those, when I had those times where I got that feedback, which was often, I really felt that that my team members were enjoying their job, and they were feeling valued, and they left work at the end of the day feeling a sense of satisfaction. So it's also good when you know that your team are happy, because it's that old, process of forming, storming, norming, and performing as a team. And when there's
Mm.
change management or things going on, every single team goes back to the start. They've got to reform. There's a new strategy. There's a new managing director. there's a reorg, whatever that looks like. You've been through right sizing, so you're impacted, right? And healthy and high performing teams move through the storming phase quicker than any other team would. And you get back to norming very quickly because that radical candor, the transparency, they understand what's impacted for them, what the opportunity from that impact could be. Because sadly, when there's reorganizations and right sizing and stuff, it often comes with opportunities because the organisation is trying to do different and try and do better. So people that are working hard or have niche skills, sometimes it can have an opening that wouldn't otherwise have been created. And a high-performing team only surges when it needs to, and they come together as a collective. They get the job done because they know the team, they know the strengths of the team, and they leverage every bit of that. And then they drop back to norming. Because no team should stay at high performing. It's unsustainable, it's fatiguing, it's unmanageable, and it's not needed. The amount of leaders or managers I saw who rejoiced in their team being a high performing team, and I'm like, well, you're an idiot because they're going to burn out. 80% of the rule for the year is come to work and do your job. 30 to 20% is going to be, I need you to step up. And either you as a team or us as you as a team member or us as a team. And when they surge and really do great work and lean into something that's needed, and then you celebrate that and drop back to the normal day, I can guarantee you every single time you need all hands on deck, you'll get them. So
absolutely.
I
love that, Michelle, I love that because what you talk about there is it's like a sporting team, like a football team. They're not training at 100% day in, day out. There is ebbs and flows and there's different waves and cycles so that when they do need to perform at their best, on game day or for NRL Magic round, they can turn it on because they've got that core of capability, but resilience in the fact that they've prepared well, but resilience because they've got something else to give. They've got that extra bit, that extra 20% to surge for a defined period of time. So that's the resilience in that case works in both ways. It's protective, but it also gives you that bit of extra to get over the line when you need to.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You just remind me, my ex-husband played hockey for Australia and he was a Victorian coach and he was an AIS coach. My daughter ended up representing Australia in sailing, and she's actually a world champion. So when she was a teenager, she was talking to her dad about the team and the unrest in the team. It was teenage girl stuff and teenage boy stuff, right? And he just said, Georgie, the team of today is not the team of tomorrow. Don't worry about the personalities in the team. That's and the performance in the team. That's the coach's job. And he said, I can guarantee you, if there's rot in that team that needs to go or behaviours that need to change, you need to look to the coach and you need to listen to the coach. Right? And she did. And after that, there'd be gossip going on and different things, and it was water for ducks back. She'd go, whatever. And so that was a really interesting statement that the team of today is not the team of tomorrow. So if it's an underperforming team, you need to trust in the leadership that they will address that and that they won't be complacent or complicit in that. There's also someone in my professional network, an elite athlete, a footballer, and he shared a story one day about going after a Brownlow medal. And he decided that, the team decided the best way for him to achieve that was during the game to give him feedback. And they agreed that he had to feel a sense when he walked off the field that he had played at a 7 in every game. He was a consistent player, and they agreed on the number of 7. And so he'd be running around the pitch, and he'd turn around in the middle of a game, and he'd say to someone, "What's my number?" And they'd go 9, and he'd know that he could drop back a bit and not risk injury, not risk anything. Or they'd go 3, and he knew he had to pick up his game. And conversely, he'd be running around, and he would just hear a number thrown at him by somebody. They'd go 4, and he'd go, right, I'm back in the game. Won a Brownlow. taking feedback, 360 genuine feedback, and knowing, again, those measures of success. What's the data we're going to hinge that says we're successful? And Boeing always used to say, what we monitor and measure, we achieve. All right? That's big leadership stuff. It's okay to have a new strategy, okay to have a new game plan, whatever it might be, but what are you monitoring and measuring that says you're succeeding? Very clear with a sporting team, you've either won or you lost, like that's, but underneath that, when you lose, they look at, well, how many disposals did you have? How many of this? So they look at the stats that have changed. If they look at a good game where they've won, and they say, well, what did the data look like for our team? Well, we held the possession more than 100 times, and this one we held it at 40. So we've just got to grab the ball, right? So there's always data behind everything. There's a science behind that success. And the other thing John used to say about the hockey teams was, he said, the great thing about being in a team sport and knowing your team and all training well with, and going out there, running out on the day with a common goal, was that if you have a bad day, your team will back you. Because out of a hockey team of 13, you are never at an Olympic standard down, world champion standard level down. You are not going to have a day, or rarely will have a day, where everybody is on point and they don't miss a beat. Right? So, yeah, he said, as a team sport, the great thing is, if you know each other and you trust each other and you're there with 100% common goal and full alignment and purpose, when you have a bad day, your team will back you. And so it's interesting, right? I think that's why a lot of athletes make good business people too. They're very disciplined, and they really understand what team sport, what that looks like and what that means.
Yeah, the understanding that you can't do everything on your own, nor should you expect to.
Right, you got a role to play.
That's a great attitude.
Yep, you've got a role to play.
Yeah, exactly. And what you talked about there with your friend who was getting feedback from their teammates, that tells me, or that is when we know that the culture is strong and alive and well, because it wasn't the coach who was having to provide all the feedback. It wasn't the coach saying, hey, you go say to him they know what the standard is. They've agreed to what the standards are, and they're holding each other to account. But more importantly, they're supporting each other with feedback when the standard is slipping, when the performance standard is slipping. And that's when we know, as a leader, we can get up and walk away from the culture, and it's going to continue on after us. That's when we know our legacy as a leader is a strong, healthy, growth-focused culture, because it's not dependent on us to give all the answers or make all the decisions.
And in that circumstance, the desire of that player to achieve that recognition was celebrated. And it's the same as saying, within your own team, your succession plan and your exit strategy for your own role. Recognizing who the strong team members are and openly working with them to develop their personal and professional skills so they can compete for your role when you leave it. And all the team acknowledging that team member is, putting up their hand to be a leader in the organization, whether it's your role or another role, it doesn't matter, right? But acknowledging and celebrating the aspirations within your team and working together as a collective to uplift that person is incredibly healthy. That, to your point, that was at a time that team were one of the highest performing teams in modern history, and still to this day on record. And it really does exemplify how healthy the culture was, that they wanted to uplift and celebrate individuals within that team, because that told them that they were a team, and that led their values on and off the field. So it's a really interesting thing to unpack. It's quite complex, actually. It sounds easy. Oh, you're a 4 today, you're a 9. No, there's a lot more below that waterline. And to your point, it's culture and values driven, and they were an extremely high performing team, and everybody stepped up when they needed to. So yeah, it's interesting, right?
It is. It's those are always interesting studies that you can see, across sport, across business, across really anything, and you can still see back to your initial lesson about communication. Well, in that culture, they're communicating to each other, their wants, their needs, their desires, when they need support, when they're happy to give support, and they're communicating through feedback. So communication, again, if we're not talking about it, well, it's just going to go away, and it's going to get lost.
And the other thing is,
So
it was
I'll,
real-time feedback,
mm, yep,
and it was received in the spirit of and with the intent. So that individual knew that they were providing real-time feedback to help them achieve their goal.
mm,
So it was received and given in the spirit of that. So it was genuine. And
yes,
so people felt safe to give it. They received it, and hard pill to swallow when they turn around and go 3, and you've got to really step up, right? You're fundamentally failing in that moment. You're failing to deliver what you need to deliver. And so it takes a very strong individual to go, okay, received and heard. I asked for it, I've received it, and I've heard it. And I'm now going to respond. And I've got to do it now. I've got another 22 minutes in this game, right? So, that shows resilience, it shows agility, it shows safe zones, it shows, common goal, all of those things.
yeah, absolutely. And that, yeah, it takes, like you said there, it takes a lot of personal resilience and cultural resilience to work in that environment. So I do want to go back to talking about you now. And we've touched on resilience a few times here. So we know, and as you've said, resilience as a leader, but things are going to be hard. We're going to have to make hard decisions. We're going to have things that challenge our own beliefs, that challenge our own values, that are going to, things that happen that cause an emotional response or an emotional reaction within us. And it's the resilience that helps us work through that to still move in a productive direction. So how do you personally build and maintain resilience for yourself as not just as a leader, but as a human being?
I think the thing for me is when I've been faced with really tough times or really tough decisions, I've made sure that they were informed and that I could stand by them and I could back them. Because I think it's really hard to remain resilient if every other time someone goes, "Oh, but you totally stuffed that up, Michelle. There was no evidence behind what you did. You made the wrong decision. It wasn't informed." And so then you second guess yourself. You have that imposter syndrome comes in, all of those sorts of things, which is all natural human behaviors. I don't care who you are. You could be a CEO of a global company or a manager of a team of 10. But when you're faced with those difficult times, if you're not confident you made the best decision with the best available amount of information at that time, then it's really, really difficult to bounce back. And there's only so many times you can do that. So for me, it was about making sure if the average person, if they knew Michelle Creevey in a meeting, because I'm a big sky thinker and I can visualize things and I can, I'm a thought leader in a lot of ways, often would see me react very quickly with solutions, like solutioning something. And I think unless they really got to know me, they didn't realize that before I press go and really wanted to implement something, I would make sure that I pulled the subject matter experts in. I'd make sure that I got the data. It mightn't sound like it in the
Hmm.
first meeting when I go, I think we should do all of this. And, sounds like you're a bit rogue and a bit, whatever. But I would always quell that moment and go back and make sure I knew I had all the right information. I knew where we were heading. So I think the best way to survive that and become resilient is to trust yourself and to
Mm-hmm.
have the right processes in place to make sure that before you um, react to a difficult moment or a difficult decision, that you're confident you've got the right amount of information and the right people. You've worked through that with the right people. Um, but I think it's also not letting yourself down. As people, we've got a gut instinct and trade on that. If something doesn't feel right,
Mm.
do some investigating. You know, and so I think that does build more resilience, is trusting yourself but also knowing when to stop and take the time and space before you react. And a great example from a leader years ago was whenever they had to send a really tough email to someone, they would draft it up and they'd leave it for 24 hours in their inbox or overnight. And then they'd open it up and they'd reread it the next day and say to themselves, do I still feel that way? And if it was a yes, they'd hit send. If they looked at it and went, yeah, no, I think I was just had a bit of energy about that. My temper was a bit high yesterday, or I'm not really conveying the messaging in the way that I need to because I just fired off this email, they'd change it. And that leader told me on a number of occasions, they just go, just delete it. It's not important anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So taking the time, giving yourself the time and space to think. Sometimes it's only 5 minutes, right? But making sure you actively say to yourself, I'm at a crossroad here. It's a tough moment or a tough decision to be made. What do I need that's going to inform my response? Or, who do I need? Do I need to say, we can't make a decision because James isn't here and he's a subject matter expert. So we are not making a decision in this meeting. We're going to brief James. We're going to bring him in, right? And that's also great leadership, is to stop and say, have we got everybody that we need? And so for me, having those natural behaviours as much as I could and checking myself on that did build my resilience, because you learn to fail fast and you learn to live with something that fails because you go, okay, lesson learnt, no worries. So, yeah, that was kind of me.
Yeah, no, I love what you've talked about there, because it speaks to the concept of conscious competence, is that if you have to make a decision, well, do it with intent. If you are going to respond to a challenging situation, do it intentionally. So you're, as leaders, we can't afford to be reactive, but we do need to be responsive. And to do that, that means we need to ask ourselves a few questions and reflect on, okay, what do I need to do in this situation? What does the situation require of me? And what do I need to find out or explore or be patient with in order to have the influence that I want to have? Because if we don't, well, we can very quickly add to the problem. We can very quickly become part of the problem. And that's not what we want to be as leaders. And which brings me, I guess, to probably the before we start to wrap up, the final question that I'd love to ask you is, this is a common question that everyone who comes across this podcast is going to get, is, as a leader, when did you encounter a situation where you realized you were in fact part of the problem? And what did you do about it?
The story that comes to mind is a personal story versus a leadership story with my team.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a time when I realised, and it wasn't over a long course of time, it was over like 4 or 5 months, but I realised what was happening was the director that I reported to was not adding me into ad hoc meetings that were talking about problems across supply chain and things that had to be fixed, or those idea storming meetings about improvements and everything else. And I remember thinking to myself, hey, hold on a second, I'm one of the most productivity improvement driven people in this organization. Like, I'm talking about the supply chain organization. I know the organization. I know the customers. I know its pain points. I know how it operates. And a lot of these discussions that were happening directly impacted me or my team. And I was like, why am I being excluded? I have done something here to change that director's behavior of including me. And I knew it was career limiting. I knew I was getting off track with that relationship. And so I just embraced it. And I sent the director an email, and in the subject line, I put career catch up. And in the email, I said, hey, just hoping you'd have a half an hour in the next week or so that we could grab a coffee. And of course, they were receptive to that. And we went out for a coffee and we sat down. And after the general chit chat at the, till and ordering a coffee and all that sort of stuff, sat down, I just said, at some stage, I've lost your trust. I don't know when, I don't know how, and I don't know what I did, but I need to regain it, because I'm not being included in changes and productivity and improvements and the roadmap or the strategy that is impacting my team, me and my team, and I need to know how I can fix that. And I remember them sitting back in their chair, kind of a little bit stunned that I was so open with my conversation with them and just acknowledged that I had done something to get off track, because I've been reporting to them for about 4 years up until that point and was very successful, really good working team, very respectful relationship with that director. And then all of a sudden it just broke. And he said, "Well, Michelle," this was the time when Boeing had won 17 for 17 programs, and it was the most amount of growth that they'd had in their history in Australia, or new geographical sites, etc. It was boom time, all right? Went from 1,200 team members to 3,000, I think, in a space of 14 or 15 months. The HR teams were recruiting what was the equivalent of a large business, which is 200 people, every quarter.
Wow.
So you can imagine the demand on procurement. Every single new team member required all new plug and play equipment, another desk, another chair, another office, another building. Was that growth. So it was big. And they said to me, "Well, when I was bringing you into my office with something that needed to be fixed, you would tell me the 17 things that were related to that and were broken. And you would leave and I would feel worse about supply chain than ever. And I would think we were absolutely failing as an organization. And I felt miserable as a director." And he said, and I had a leader in the business, or one of my peers, who identified something that was broken or needed to be fixed. And I was asking you as a subject matter expert and the manager that should be owning that to fix it. And he said, "Michelle, when I call you into my office and I tell you a problem, can you just fix that problem? Get it done as quickly and with as much agility and professionalism as we can, so we can report that up that we've mitigated something and we've sorted it." And then he said, "And then the other 17 things, come back to me and go, are you happy if I work that now? And do you mind if I get a bit of support to clean that up as well?" And he said, "If you did that, I'm happy. Fine." He said, "But just fix the problem I've asked you." So that was the active listening bit that I'm talking about. I was not actively listening with a director. And so I lost his trust. He just couldn't trust me. And I became a really fatiguing direct report of his to engage with. And it was a time when the business was surging and everybody was risking burnout. And he just went, "Oh, I can't handle bringing Michelle into my office when I've got a problem, because she tells me 17 other things are broken and it's exhausting." So, really for me, that was a reflection on holding myself accountable and checking myself. I knew at some stage I didn't exemplify behaviors, or I didn't conduct myself in a way that had, um, you know, impacted a highly valuable relationship for a lot of reasons for me. And I knew it was impacting the team, because the director was bypassing me in terms of, productivity improvements, process, and other things that ultimately were going to impact my team and how they did their job and what was required of them to execute the work. So it absolutely turned around my relationship with the director. And to this day, I haven't worked in the organisation for 12 months, and I caught up with him for a coffee last week, and we have a great catch up. It's a really valued connection that I've still got to this day, and I hope to enjoy for a long time. But it was me checking myself and owning that something didn't feel right, not to ignore it, and not to be shy and avoid a tough conversation. So, and I actually just wrote a LinkedIn article that I posted today, which is about when you've got to have tough conversations, go out and have a coffee or do a walk around the block, because it shifts the energy. If you're doing it in an office, it feels like you're performance managing someone. If you go out for have a coffee, it's giving feedback and you're having a chat. And the same with suppliers, right? You're walking shoulder and shoulder through the botanical gardens talking about the contract and how it's performing. We'll tell you more in that conversation than a quarterly review with 12 PowerPoint slides. So for me, leadership is about recognizing we're humans and making sure that with every moment, when you're either celebrating or you're having to deal with a tough issue, that you put the person first and you lead the conversation in a way that it's people first. You'll always get what you need. And they'll be the most fulfilling times as a leader when you put your people first.
Absolutely. And what you've talked about there in your story is the issues were not process. The issues were not about things. It was a personal issue. And that is leadership. Leadership is people. Management, and I think that's the fundamental difference between leadership and management, is whatever it is, management moves the pieces. There's processes to manage things. There's instructions to manage things. But people are the greatest asset that any business has. And that's where because leadership moves the people, human-centered leadership is required to get the most out of an organization, because like everything you've talked about in here, in this podcast is, well, if we want to grow productivity and we want to get more out of people, then they need to feel connected to the organization. They need to feel safe and happy and enthusiastic to come to work. And that will help us do more. And when we do more and we achieve together, well, we feel happier at work. But like your story you told about your football friend, the culture there wasn't dependent on one leader. The culture there had capacity to do what it needed to do and continue to drive towards high performance for that individual, but also for the organization as a whole, for the team as a whole, without dependence on the captain or the coach or the board of directors. That's when we know that leadership isn't just resident in a couple of individuals. Leadership is resident at every level of the organization, within every person, because it doesn't require a title. Leadership is a choice, and anyone can make the choice to be a leader, which is exactly what you did in addressing that challenge of trust. Is you stepped up as a leader and led upwards in that case to bring into the conversation where we needed to go.
Yeah, and I never circled back to that director and asked him how he felt about the conversation, but as I said, it turned around our relationship for the better, and it became healthier and stronger than ever. But I got the feeling in that conversation that he felt a little bit disappointed in himself, that he hadn't checked his own behaviour, because he shouldn't have circumnavigated me and circumvented me because he was annoyed with me and my behaviours at the time. He should have dealt with that head on. But what I do give him, the reason I never worried about that was it was a time when the whole business was surging and everyone was fatigued, and you really could not point the finger at every little weakness that someone displayed every given minute, because for the most part, everyone was exhausted. It was really heavy lifting. I was doing 70 to 90-hour weeks consistently. We bedded down the team, got everything we needed. I got a lot of time in lieu off. I was very well looked after. In the weeks that I did big hours, it wasn't taken for granted, and I was supported. And it wasn't a common thing, but it would surge. It would just continue to do that every now and then over the course of nearly probably 18 months, 2 years. But the human thing I knew that happened with him was he was too exhausted and too beaten down to come to me to say, I don't like this behaviour of you doing this. I just need you to solve that one problem. So for him, he just went, I'm just going to find someone who can do what I want them to do. But he knew he wasn't delegating with purpose, and he was working outside of the delegation of authority and the chain of command. He was almost usurping my authority by delegating to people who didn't have that authority. So in saying to him, I've lost your trust somewhere and I need to get that back, I think he also recognised that his response to that wasn't the right leadership behaviours. And he never did that again. I never saw him do it to any other team member. Absolutely.
So in that case, you've done exactly what you talked about back at the start, is be the change that you want to see.
Yeah, 100%.
And that behavioural reference is what starts to shift culture, which is great. And I think that is as good a note as any to wrap this up, because it brings us right back around to the start about communication. Communication is key to leadership, because that is how we work with people, and people are the best part and the worst part about leadership, to be perfectly honest.
Yep. And transparent and radical candor. You know?
Absolutely. Exactly. Transparency, radical candor, and that in that community, that's how we communicate. And that's what builds trust, and that's what builds connection. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much, Michelle, for everything you've spoken about. I appreciate your vulnerability. I appreciate your radical candor. in sharing these lessons, because a lot of the time leadership can feel quite lonely and we can feel like we're the only ones who are dealing with these challenges, but that's just not true. Thanks for joining me and Michelle for another episode of Lead on Purpose. If this has given you something to reflect on or something to think about, then that's awesome. Let us know about it in the comments and keep the discussion going. Please like, subscribe, and share this episode with someone you know who wants to be a better leader. And remember that leadership is not a title, it's a choice. So make that choice and continue to lead on purpose. I'm James Middleton, and this is
Michelle Creevey.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, James.